Hello! This time I would like to present you some kind of summary, because this way you can see how the previous videos are helpful in navigating into the pawn endgames, and you can just feel more comfortable playing them, and therefore I'll present 8 simple tips to understand pawn endgames. By the way, these are extracted from the following concepts. The first one, pawn box, it was the square of the pawn. The second one, pawn key squares, it was the Tetris method and how to promote. The third one, the opposition, how and when to use it. And the fourth one, fixed pawn squares, therefore 6 squares to remember. And now, based on these videos that I recorded and uploaded, I just extracted 8 simple tips to understand pawn endgames, and I hope you will like it, because I have the impression they are pretty much helpful in understanding the basic concepts, and you do not need to make a lot of calculations. Instead of that, you can pretty quickly understand if the position is won or if the position is drawn based on these simple tips that I created for you. I hope you will like it, and let's get started. Let's have a look at this position. Now we know that when the pawn reaches 7th rank without check, it gets promoted. But how to see it on the board? We have the position with the king standing up in opposition, and now it is white to move. Now, white step back because the pawn needs to move. After that, black gets the opposition even though it's not that much important. The pawn moves forward and the king needs to get the left side. If the king gets to the right side, the pawn promotes without any assistance. Therefore, the king gets at the same file as the pawn, and the pawn gets to the 7th rank without check. And now the rule is the following. If the pawn gets to the 7th rank without check, it gets promoted. Why? Because the king must step back, leaving the blockade square for the pawn and the promotion square as well, and the king is having the control of these 3 squares, and this is the stairway to heaven, therefore the pawn gets promoted. After the king step back anywhere, we have the new queen and they're winning the game. Another position that is pretty similar is the same position, but this time it is black to move. And now let's have a look about this tip. If the king step back, and now we have stairway to heaven, therefore at this moment the pawn is getting into the promotion with the king's assistance. And now, even though it is the check on the 7th rank, but take notice the king is already having the promotion squared and the pawn covered. Therefore, it's like a little bit of exception, because normally if the pawn gets to the 7th rank, it gets promoted. This is a little bit like exception, or maybe a rule needs to be a little bit more adjusted. But anyway, you now know that if the pawn gets to the 7th rank with check, but the king is having the promotion square and the pawn protected, then of course it's winning. Therefore, it may be a little bit like an exception. And now let's have another tip. When the king reaches one of the key squares of passed pawn, the pawn gets promoted. And how it works. And now let's have a look. The key squares of the passed pawn, if the pawn hasn't crossed half of the board, are 2 ranks above. And at this moment, these are these 3 squares. And now it is white to play. White gets to the square e5. Now they want to reach one of the key squares of the passed pawn. Black needs to stop it. After that, white is having the opposition, forcing the black king to step back either way. And after that, white reaches one of the key squares of the passed pawn. Therefore, at this moment, the position is easily won if you know how to convert it. And I'll just show you briefly. After the king gets to d8, the simplest way is to make the opposition, because in a moment, the king gets into one of the squares that having the opportunity to create the stairway to heaven. And now, after the king step back, we are going the other direction. And now we can see that there is the stairway to heaven and the pawn is unstoppable. And now let's check out what happens if the same tip is related to the pawn that is a little bit farther up the board. The pawn is a bit more advanced. Of course, we remember that if the pawn has crossed the half of the board, the key squares of the pawn are just 1 rank above. Therefore, these are the key squares. And now, if it is white, white is just having the move playing king e6, and then they are already in one of the key squares of the pawn, and therefore they are just simply winning. And now the same idea as previously. As you can see, they can step back, creating the stairway to heaven, and the win is pretty much obvious. And now the next tip. When the pawn gets fixed by the defending king, it cannot get promoted. And now let's have a look how it works. Now it is black to move, and black is fixing the pawn. Fixing the pawn means that you are just having the pawn immobile, the pawn cannot move forward, and therefore at this moment white pawn cannot make any progress. And that's why white tries to unlock the pawn. After the king gets at the same rank as the pawn, the king needs to protect the pawn, and then if the pawn moves forward, the king fixes the pawn again. And now it is the repetitive process, and as you can see, at this moment is the most important. Now there is the only move that draws the game. Now the move that you need to get into the same rank as the same file as the pawn. And now after this move, if the pawn gets right side, we are just using the opposition. And now the rule that we just mentioned previously, if the pawn gets to the 7th rank without check, it gets promoted, but this time the pawn gets to the 7th rank with check. And that's why after the king blocks the pawn, it is either stalemate, or if the king leaves the protection of the pawn, then the black king captures the pawn, resulting in a draw. Another tip: in order to win the fixed pawn, we need to reach any of the 6 squares, 3 from the left and the right side of the pawn, and if the defending king is in front of the pawn. And now let's have a look how it works. Now we can see that if we want to win the black's pawn, we are playing white, we need to get white king into one of the squares highlighted red. And now we start with king f4. Why? Because we are using the concept of opposition in order to reach any of the squares. If we just get into one of the squares with the white king, we are going to win the black pawn. Therefore, black plays king e6, and now they need to leave one of the squares for the white king. And now white king has reached one of the key squares of the fixed pawn, therefore the pawn would be won. And now it is just the simple stuff that we mentioned many times. And now at this moment, very important stuff, the king cannot protect the pawn from any of these squares. Therefore, black king needs to leave the king unprotected. After the capture, there is the winning pawn, as we just already mentioned, but due to the opposition by black, this is drawn because white king is unable to reach any of the key squares. That's why, even though we are winning the pawn, it doesn't mean we are winning the game. And now another tip. If you cannot fix the pawn, the best way to hold the position is not to allow the king to reach any of the key squares. And let's check it out. First, let's have a look at the position if the king and the pawn are on the same rank. And now, what happens if it is black to move? Normally, black would play fixing the pawn immediately by the king, but it's not possible due to the white king having control of this square. And that's why we are just having with the reserve square. And now at this moment, if the pawn advances, we cannot get the opposition because the pawn is attacking the square, and therefore black needs to step back. After going closer, we are just using the concept of opposition, not allowing for the white king to get into the next rank with the king. Therefore, the pawn must move in order to make progress. After the king fixes the pawn, the king needs to get into this square in order to defend the pawn. And now the only move that draws the game. And after this, we are just using the concept of opposition. And after the pawn gets to the 7th rank with check, the pawn cannot be promoted, and therefore the game ends in a draw. Another idea of the same tip. Let's have a look. We are just having the position that the king is not in the same rank as the pawn, but the pawn is in front. The king is in front of the pawn. And therefore, at this moment, we use the concept of opposition, not allowing to reach any of the key squares of the passed pawn for the white king. And therefore, the game ends in a draw. And now, as you can see, all of the time black king is not allowing the king to infiltrate. And now if the king cannot get forward, the pawn must move. If the pawn moves, the key squares of the passed pawn are moving upwards. And therefore at this moment you can see these three squares that white king needs to reach in order to win the game. After the king gets to d7, we are just pushing the pawn, otherwise the king cannot make progress due to the control for the black king. And now if the pawn moves forward, the only move that draws the game, but good enough. And after the king gets here, we are just using the concept of opposition, and if the pawn gets to the 7th rank with check, the game is drawn. And now another tip. If the pawn crossed half of the board and the king reached any of the key squares, the position is winning regardless of the opposition and who is on the move. And let's check it out how it works. Now as you can see, the king is above the pawn, the king is in front of the pawn, and the pawn has crossed the half of the board. Therefore, at this moment, white king reached one of the key squares of the passed pawn, therefore the position is won. And let's check out what happens. If white starts, they cannot make the pawn moves because the pawn is fixed by its own king. Therefore, they need to get into one of the key squares left or right. It doesn't matter which one, by the way. And now, the black king needs to get into the opposition. And now we are using the concept of stolen opposition, because this way it helps us the pawn to get promoted. Therefore, the pawn gets to the 7th rank without check. Now, the pawn gets forward. The king needs to get into the same rank, the same file as the pawn. After pushing the pawn up to the 7th rank, being protected, as we can see, the king needs to leave the promotion square. And after leaving the promotion square, we are having the stairway to heaven, and we can see that the position is pretty easily won. And now the same position, but this time we are just having black to move. Therefore, regardless who is on the move, and regardless if it is the opposition or not, if the pawn has crossed the half of the board and the king is in front of the pawn, it is the position that is won. And now black to play. It is very easy position, therefore I'll just do it pretty quickly. After the king step back, we are just having stairway to heaven, and now the game is over. The pawn reaches the last rank. And now as we can see, the pawn reaches the last rank because of the stairway to heaven. It means that 3 squares that are getting the pawn up to the last rank are covered by the king from the side. Of course, if the king gets the right side, we are having the same idea. All of these squares covered by the king, stairway to heaven. And now, of course, even though the pawn gets to the 7th rank with check, but this is the exception because the pawn and the king, the king is protecting the pawn and controlling the promotion square. Therefore, a little bit like an exception. And now at this moment, of course, the position is easily won. And the time for the next tip. The simplest way to convert the winning pawn endgame is to create and control stairway to heaven. And now, as we just already seen previously, we can just play with the king white to play, having the stairway to heaven, and pawn gets to the promotion. Therefore, probably this is one of the simplest way to understand how easy it is to have the pawn promoted if the king of the defending side cannot get the king in front of the file of the pawn. Therefore, that's why it's that much important. And now you may ask if the stairway to heaven idea is related to just the pawns that are not the edge pawns, not the rook pawns. And now I need to answer this question pretty easily. Actually, it is related to any pawns, no matter if there are the central pawns or the edge pawns. And now let's check it out how it works. At this moment, stairway to heaven is just these squares that are highlighted red, and now you can see that white king is already having these squares controlled, and black king cannot approach the king, and the pawn is unstoppable. Therefore, it can apply into any of the pawns. And the last tip for today, the easiest type of pawn endgame to defend is the edge pawn. 2 ways of defending. 4 squares connected to the corner and additional 2 when we lock the attacking king in front of the pawn. And let's check out how it works. Now as we can see, the black king needs to get into one of these 4 squares in order to draw this position. And that's why the only move for black to draw this position is getting the king f8 in order to reach any of the squares we had just mentioned. And now, after the pawn moves forward, the king reached already one of the first squares, therefore the position is easily drawn. And that's why, as you can see, if the king reaches any of these four squares, they are very important and very easy to understand. These are four squares if we are counting all of the squares from the corner and the corner itself as well. Therefore, pretty easy to understand and remember. And the last position, pretty much the same. This time the white king is in front of the pawn, therefore we are going to lock the attacking king and using two squares additional one to defend this position and get the draw. Now black to move. Black to move, having the king in one of these four squares, because at this moment they are going to reach one of the blue squares. If they can do it, it's easy draw as well. And now white says no, we are not going to give you any of these four squares, and black is going up and down for these two additional ones, and that's why after the pawn goes forward, the king is getting up and down, up and down, up and down, and if the pawn gets to the 7th rank, now black king is stalemating white, therefore the king cannot leave the corner, the pawn cannot advance, white is to move, white doesn't have any legal moves, therefore a draw. Of course, there's one more interesting example at this position that we need to have a look. After the king gets to the square f8, if white doesn't want to have this scenario as we have just seen, they get the king into the g6, unlocking the king and having the opportunity to push the pawn forward. Of course, it doesn't help because black king is getting into one of the four squares we have already mentioned, and therefore it's a draw as well. The same as previously, this time white is stalemating black. And now the summary. As we can see, these were the tips that can help you to understand the simple pawn endgames, and I guess they should be helpful in order to understand the positions that we have analyzed, and you can apply them pretty quickly if you understand the idea behind it, and at the same time they can help you in the practical play because they are going to help you with the making less calculations but more relying on the principles, rules and tips. And that's why I hope they are going to be pretty much helpful. Okay, enough for today. I guess you enjoyed the video. I hope it's going to be pretty much helpful. Thank you very much for watching and for supporting me, and see you next time. Take care